The next opinion was on the implementation effort for standards. So I just explained that there were 4 types of standards in this survey: the Codex Alimentarius, the EU legislation, the national legislation, and the private standards. And we asked our participants to rank how high or how low the efforts are for the farmer to get the standard implemented. And they could go from very low effort to very high effort. And here you see the average scores. It is for the farmers from the south, because we have in the next slide the same picture for the farmers from the north. And you can see that the Codex Alimentarius standards and the national standards have a score of 3.4 and 3.3, so around moderate, but that they find that EU legislation and in particular private standards ask a very high effort to get implemented. So this picture says that private standards and EU legislation are asking the highest effort compared to Codex and national legislation to get implemented. If we go now to the same question, but then for the farmers from the north, we see here that the average scores, so it's the same question, and we ask, is it a very low effort or very high effort? And then we see here Codex Alimentarius. People think that it does not ask a very high effort to get these implemented, but they think that private standards are asking a very high effort. So for the farmers from the north, it are private standards that are asking the highest effort compared to Codex, EU and national legislation. We also asked then, in an open question, which points ask the most effort for implementation. And for the North group, there were 30 citations, so 30 items that the people set. And for the South group, there were 38 citations. So we asked them, what is the most important or most difficult for you to get implemented? And we can see that on number 1, the most important, both for the northern farmers and the southern farmers, are pesticide residues testing and compliance with strong MRLs. So that's the most important item. Then for the southern farmers, it were hygiene requirements, for example, hand wash facilities and toilets nearby the farm. And then for the northern farmers, it were risk analysis, and both found that there was a very high burden of administration linked to standards. Then we also asked to the people what is needed for better implementation of these standards at the farmer level and at country level. And they could choose out of the list of 9 items, the 3 most important ones. And the most important one was access to understandable guidelines of good agricultural practices, and also access and investment in technology. And for the southern farmers, it was also financial support. On country level, they could choose 2 out of 6, and there it was found that the existence and the support by farmer associations and trade associations was found to be very important, and also the presence of good functioning competent authorities. It is often claimed, it was also said this morning, that standards are excluding farmers from high-value markets. And this question deals with that. The opinion stated that due to the complexity and high demands of the standards, farmers are increasingly being excluded from financial high-value export markets. So this opinion says standards are excluding farmers from high-value markets. This is again the picture for the South. The participants could say whether they totally disagreed with the opinion, or they totally agreed, or say no opinion. And then you can see here again the 4 types of standards: the Codex Alimentarius, EU legislation, national legislation, and private standards. And you can see here national legislation are moderately seen as excluding the farmers from high-value markets, but private standards, again with a score of 4.2, and EU legislation with a score of 4.2 are seen as excluding farmers from high-value markets. So the Codex Alimentarius is a bit seen as excluding farmers, but stronger EU and private standards are perceived to exclude southern farmers from high-value markets. If we ask the same question to the experts for the northern farm, then we can see that here the private standards are having the highest score, and for example, Codex and EU and national legislation have the lowest score. So for the southern farmers, it are the EU legislation and the private standards that are excluding the farmers, and for the northern farmers, it are the private standards. And we see here average scores of 3.8 and 3.9, it meaning that most participants agree that private standards are becoming more important for the structure and organization of the fresh produce supply chain than legislation. And then we had the same question, but then the importance for the assurance of the food safety. So the opinion stated that private food safety and quality standards are becoming more important than legislation for the assurance of the food safety, again scoring from 1 to 5. And we can see a different picture for the northern farmers than for the southern farmers. Here we see an average of 3.4, and here we see an average of 4. So we see a different picture, and this can be explained because in many southern countries, the enforcement of legislation is not that strong as in many northern countries. And so they need to rely more on the private standards. So in conclusion here, participants for the South strongly agree on the importance of private standards for the assurance of food safety. Then standards as a non-tariff barrier to trade. So considerable progress has been made since the Second World War on reducing the tariff taxes. So before, a lot of taxes had to be paid when you were exporting, and these were reduced strongly. But now there seem to be new barriers, namely the hygiene requirements and also the requirements on pesticide residues and mycotoxin levels that are seen as the new barriers, as non-tariff barriers to trade. And we asked our experts what they found of this opinion, whether fresh produce EU food legislation may act as a non-tariff barrier to trade and thus affect trade and interfere with access to markets. And then we had again a scale, very low effect on trade. So the EU legislation has a very low effect on trade to a very high effect on trade. And here you see the results in histogram, and you see a very different picture for the northern farmers and the southern farmers. So here is 2.8 the average, and here is 4.2. So here there's about 80% thinking that EU legislation acts as a non-tariff barrier to trade for the southern farmers. So the participants for the South strongly agree on the effect of EU legislation as a non-tariff barrier to trade. And then we go and have a look at the same question, but then for the private standards. So the opinion was private fresh produce food safety and quality standards act as a non-tariff barrier to trade and thus affect trade and interfere with access to markets. Again, the same scale. And here we see an average of 3.5, so it's moderate to high for the northern farmers, but for the southern it is quite clear. There's an average from 4.1, so about 60% thinks that there is a high effect to very high effect on trade. So private standards are also seen as a non-tariff barrier to trade, in particular by the participants for the southern farmers.